My name is Binju Raksa. I'm the Director of Urban Design and Development International Program here at Faculty of Adjunct Thammasat University. So I would like you all to specially served by Professor Kim Dovey from the University of Melbourne. Before we begin, allow me to introduce our program a little bit. Our program is relatively young. We have just started our first academic year in August, so it has been just several months. And all the students in the blue t-shirt, they are the first batch of our program. Okay, we plan to be a place to study and research on the design and development of cities in Asia and Southeast Asia in particular. And we had an international forum discussing about the issue of urban design in the 21st century. And we also plan for this lecture series. And we are very glad that today we have Professor Dovey to become our first speaker of the lecture series. Before we get started, I would like to invite Ajahn Bunanan Natakun to introduce Kim a little bit, and then we're going to present Kim the piece of token after that.
Good afternoon, everyone. Today, why I'm here because I'm the Melbourne University alumni, and also I haven't got chance to study Kim subjects, but I'm very proud to be part of the Melbourne School of Design. And today, I'm very honored and also pleased to introduce Kim Dovey, who is the Professor of Architecture and Urban Design at the University of Melbourne. And he has a PhD from the University of California, Berkeley, and he has taught in a number of leading universities in the world, including UC Berkeley, MIT, and also Melbourne. And his research is broadly focused on theories of place and also practices of power, covering a broad range of social issues in architecture and urban design. And he has written a number of books, including Becoming Places, Framing Places, and also the Fluid Cities, which is looking at the urban waterfronts, view design in urban areas. And also, his current work is focusing on the construction of place identity, urban character, and informal settlements. And he has engaged in a substantial mass media, broadcasting on his research work, and major urban and architectural development in Melbourne. So now I hand it on to Ajahn Binju.
Sorry to come back and forth. Now I would like to invite Professor Dr. Vimunsit Horayangun, the founder of the faculties and this program, to present a piece of token to Professor Dovey. Please. Okay, now I think we can start the lecture. Please welcome Professor Dovey.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you all for coming along. It's a good turnout, and I really appreciate the invitation to come and speak at Thammasat University. I have visited Thailand and Bangkok a number of times before, and not Thammasat, but I've always had a real interest in Thammasat University, because Thammasat University was the one that was started and founded by Dr. Priti, one of Thailand's great intellectuals, whose commitment was to build the culture of critical thinking. And I think it's wonderful that there is this architecture school that is now building and thriving in this way, and particularly to see an urban design, urban planning and architecture programs of this kind. I've kind of, it's always hard when you come in a little bit cold, not quite understanding where you are at and your understandings and so on. So I'll put together some slides and some things to talk about, and I'll try to leave some time for some questions in case this is not quite meeting where you are at. I warned Pan, Dr. Bunanan, that in inviting me, that I'm reasonably outspoken, so I may say things that don't necessarily meet with your expectations about the ways in which cities are designed. I'm not expecting you to agree. I would hope that you would question me and we could have that discussion, because I think that there are quite a few things about the way in which cities have been proceeding over the last century or so that are highly problematic. So some of my comments are actually going to be not about how cities should be designed, but how they shouldn't be designed. Where are we going? All right. I want to start by talking about what urban design is, and I think this is probably the first point of contention. I don't think there is any real agreement. If I have a definition of urban design, it is that it is the shaping of cities, the shaping of public space. Now that definition begs more questions than anything else, but there's another way of answering that question, which is that urban design is the messy between area, between the disciplines that we do understand reasonably well, like landscape architecture, property development, and urban planning. The Master of Urban Design in our program is MUD for short, which is MUD, of course, in English is this messy thing that you get when everything infects everything else. This idea of a between zone where it's messy, where it's complex, where nothing is particularly clear, and where different disciplines intersect, that is also my definition of urban design. I'm going to proceed from that to ask, well, if we want to understand what urban means, this word that is emblazoned on all of these wonderful T-shirts you've got, it's quite a powerful word, urban. There are in Australia, I don't know what the fashions are like here, but in Australia there is a fashion called urban. So there's a particular version of a shirt. I was once bought a shirt, and they said, "Oh, that's the urban shirt." And I said, "Well, what makes it urban?" And they said, "Well, it doesn't have a pocket," meaning there was nothing to put your pen in. So somehow to be urban was to be in a city but without a pen. I couldn't quite understand that. Nonetheless, I will stop doing these asides. The question about, well, what is a city? If you, in the English language, if you look up the European antecedents of that, it's about citizenship. And it shares its meaning with words like civil and civic and civilized. So a city is the place where civilization develops. And to be civil in English is to be courteous. And courtesy, of course, is a code that we develop when we're dealing with people that we don't know. So a city is a place where strangers meet. A city and public space is where we meet with strangers that we don't know and we perhaps don't understand, perhaps we don't even agree with them, but we learn to live together. So a city is a place where there is a kind of a civil code operating. Cities are places of connection. They emerge at ports. Bangkok is here because of the Chao Phraya River and the role of the Chao Phraya River in flows of trade and its relationship to the bay and its relationship to its hinterland. The cities are all about flows. They are not about enclosure. And cities are about production. Cities work. Cities are not some place that people thought might be a nice place to live. Cities are there because they make money for people. They are there because there are jobs. Bangkok has however many million people it has now because there are jobs here, because people come to Bangkok because of the production that happens there. And of course they become places of consumption and places of exchange, places of shopping. This is what cities are about. Cities, they are places of traffic, of intersections between things. Not just intersections between flows of trade, but also intersections between ideas. Your ideas and my ideas come together in cities. And if we look at the word urban, here we find the etymology, the origin of the word comes from the word courteous. Very similar to the idea of a city being a place where we are civil. To be urban is to be courteous. It is, again, to respect difference. It is to understand that in the city, different ideas, different desires intersect. This is what is at the essence of city, as I'm suggesting. It's linked to the idea of politeness, to the polis, which is the Roman word for city, the idea of the police, meaning that it needs usually some kind of enforcement. It's linked to politics. There is always a politics to public space, and in turn to the shaping of public space, which is what some of my work has been about. And it's about policy, which of course is what urban planners do, produce. And the final word here is public, belonging to the people. Public being the opposite of being private. Private, the word private originally being a form of deprivation. Back in Greek society, to be private was to be deprived. To be public, public space was the space of citizenship. It was the prized space. Now that's not the way we always see it these days, but that's the background that I wanted to start with. And to say that if you want to talk about the importance of urban design, I would suggest a few key words here. First of all, I've already talked about this, the economic importance of the shaping of the city. Cities are productive. The shape of streets and the ways people get around them and the ways in which we get in contact with the things that and the people that we need in cities has everything to do with economics. There's an economics of movement and exchange in the city that is productive. This is one of the key insights of the greatest of all urban thinkers, Jane Jacobs. If I were to recommend you read one book that no urban design student should ever not read, it's Jane Jacobs' The Death and Life of Great American Cities. It's the most mislabeled book in urban design history. It is not about American cities. It's about all cities. It was written 50 years ago, and just about every word of it still rings true. The environmental importance. As we move to an increasing awareness of climate change and an increasing understanding of just how serious the changes to the climate are going to be for this planet, And as we move to now more than 2 degrees of global warming, which is going to entail sea level rises and all kinds of changes, including lots of natural disasters, the transformation of our cities for a low carbon future is a key important dimension of urban design. There's a key political importance of urban design, which is to do with spatial justice. Public space, if it's really public space, if it's really urban, if it's a real city, is a space for everyone. The big sign, the big 3-dimensional sign as we drive into this campus is Tamasa, for people. Urban design is for people. It's the base. There is a public interest in urban design, and it is the only thing that legitimates urban design, in my view. If you can't legitimate, if you can't make a claim that this future is better than that one because it is better in the public interest, then in a sense you can't make the claim for urban design. And it must be about a form of justice. It must be about a form of urban design that makes public space open for everyone and that sees the outcomes of urban design as building equality of opportunity in society. There's an aesthetic dimension to this as well. I'm not a proponent of the idea of the city as a work of art because I think it plays into the notion that somehow the designer can be a godlike figure controlling the city from above, that I think is at odds with the ways in which cities actually work. But that's not to say that the city doesn't deliver a huge aesthetic benefit to its population. This is not about people going into the city and saying, gee, isn't it beautiful every day when they go to work. The aesthetic of the city is different to that. We experience the city mostly in a state of distraction. We're not here as tourists most of the time. We're here as workers or students. We're going about our business, and the city takes us by surprise and it becomes embodied in us. And sometimes we don't understand how much we love a city until we go away and leave it for a long period of time. And lastly, this social importance of urban design. Urban design bumps us into each other. It ensures that we will cross paths with a lot of strangers in the course of a given day in public space, and that we will not cross paths with a lot of others. So there is a social dimension to this, which has to do with the way in which we may or may not meet different kinds of people and form different kinds of relationships. Some of those might be economic, others might be friendship relations, others might be professional, whatever. This is a large piece of what cities do, and it's a large piece of their economic productivity as well as their social productivity. In the end, there's an important, what's often called the right to the city, a phrase that's usually attributed to the French sociologist Henri Lefebvre. The idea that the city and its public spaces belong to us all. They don't belong to the state. They belong to the people. I'm going to briefly introduce you to something that I call the urban DNA. This is a rather simplified version of a lot of urban thinking, but it's one way of remembering it. It's not the DNA. The DNA, of course, is the triple helix of the DNA of the human being. This is what I call the DMA. It is a set of conditions that do not determine the outcomes of any given city, but they are necessary, not sufficient, but somehow necessary in different combinations. Density, mix, and access. Each of them identified with a question. This is a rather simplistic way of looking at it, but I think it works in a particular way. Let's take them one at a time. Density. There are many ways of thinking about density. There are many definitions of density. But density, in a sense, is at the essence of urban life, because that's what cities do, is that they concentrate things and people and activities and buildings into a given urban area. Density is about concentration. And density is really about the answer to this question of how close can we get? It doesn't mean that that higher density is necessarily better. It's about cities being places where we come together. Just as we come together today on this campus, we come together in Bangkok. It's what makes Bangkok what it is. Buildings, people, activities, transactions coming together in close proximity. Proximity, of course, erases the friction of distance. The reasons you don't cross paths with someone who lives in London, New York or Tokyo is that you are not in proximity with them. Densities are densities of people as much as they are densities of buildings. Mix, the second of these. There are other words that we could use for mix. It can be functional mix, it can be social mix, it can be a mix of buildings and forms. But in each case, it's about a juxtaposition of different things. And here, the key question is, what's the attraction between different parts of the mix? How do different things co-function? How do putting different things together work in a city? This is again one of the great insights of the great change agents. The idea that modernist zoning, the idea that you should separate out different kinds of people, different kinds of activity, different kinds of function, that if it's a university you can't have coffee shops, if it's a housing project you can't have anyone working there, if it's a working environment you can't have anyone living there, but this is wrong. In her version it kills cities. She's been proven right on this, I think. Mix is about how all of the different activities and the particular way in which they're mapped on the right there is a mix of three primary things. The places where we live, the places where we work, and the places that we visit. By and large here today, you are all working here, you're students, this is your, in a sense, your main activity. I'm a visitor. A city mixes those three things. When you go shopping, you are visiting the shop. When you go home, that's your place of living. When you go to work, and that we circulate on a daily basis, on a weekly basis, we circulate between those functions. And one of the key aspects of urban design is to mix those functions up so that we are not forever trying to negotiate large distances between where we work, where we live, and where we visit. The third part of the DMA is access. The question here is, how do we get around? We get around by walking. There is a pedestrian network. But we also get around in cars and on motorcycles and in public transport and on bicycles. So there are road networks, there are cycle networks. There are multiple networks overlaid that answer the question one way or another, how we get around the city. By and large, over much of the late 20th century and even into this century, we're still building cities based on car networks. Cities that are essentially unsustainable, in my view. This was a very famous map by Nolli of Rome, which uses a figure ground analysis. I'm showing you, I'm not going to get into the details here of how urban designers map. These are things that I hope you would learn through your course. But this is a very famous, wonderful famous map that showed for the first time in a way that has lived across the centuries just how it is that people in Rome would imagine how they get around the city. There it is, and you put it all together, the urban DMA. But that's not the whole story, because layered on top of that Those are key decisions that urban designers make, by the way. The decisions about how dense it will be, the decisions about what the mix will be, and the decisions about the networks of flows. How do we get around? What are the attractions? And how close can we get? Not in any particular order. But layered on top of that are questions about other things. Now, at this point, if you're thinking, well, this is all getting very, very complex, I need to tell you it is complex. This is the way cities are. They are extraordinarily complex. On top of that, we need to lay questions of meaning. Now, the questions of meaning are those of expression. They're questions about how different forms of meaning are encoded into, designed into, built forms and spatial layouts. And they're questions about how we read the city. How do we understand the city in our mind? What is the meaning of the democracy monument? Built by a military dictator in the 1930s, if you know your history. Not built by a democrat, but came to represent democracy over time. Named. Sometimes parts of the city are named after something, but they don't come to me. Other times, these meanings change. This is a very complex take on the city. The Eiffel Tower, the meanings of modernity, the iconic buildings such as Geary's, sorry, I meant to do something different. Geary's build-out building, this production of iconic buildings in different cities around the world. These are all designed to transform the meanings of places. And this gets layered on top of the morphologies, which is what the urban DMA was about. And then questions about action, about what happens in public space. Unpredictable in many cases. I don't think anyone can predict exactly what will happen after the spaces are designed, but that urban design finishes and then life takes over. Political actions, everyday actions in public space. What happens there? These to me are the key questions about urban design. And the answers in terms of what might be good urban design is not something that I can deliver for you here. I think if you look at any given project, you can come up with an answer. I can come up with my answer, you can come up with yours. What's more important is that you know how to ask the questions about this. Now, I titled this lecture, Globalization. That was really the introduction to it. I better move on. And I'm going to talk a little bit about globalization and what it means, and I'm going to talk about the way in which that transforms urban design practice for all of us, whether we're in Melbourne or in Bangkok. Globalization is a condition that has been going on forever, but it has been accelerating. It has always been one planet, but it's suddenly imperative that we begin to see it as one planet, a planet that we share, and that we share the kind of care for. And climate change is the key, absolutely the key issue here. Globalization brings about an increased flexibility and mobility of capital. It brings about a position where large amounts of investment, the kind of investment that transforms cities, is now extremely flexible. The corporate decision makers who are deciding whether to invest in Bangkok or Shanghai can make that decision, and with the press of a button, the money flows one way or another. We are no longer in a situation where capital is heavy. Capital is hyper-flexible. We have a shrinking planet where we can be in contact by email and by telepresence and telephone with anyone, anywhere on the planet at any time. And there are increasing flows of people around the planet. Tourists, travellers, immigrants, refugees. And we have rapidly transforming industries, and particularly a new global division of labour, where a lot of manufacturing shifts from one part of the world to another part where labour's cheaper. So it shifts out of Australia, it shifts to places like Thailand. But then it can just as rapidly shift out again. And the entire factories and entire parts of cities that are based on one kind of production can suddenly be dead and derelict. It's a very difficult situation to manage in urban design terms. There is an increasing amount of an information economy where the economy is not based so much in the actual manufactured goods, so much as in the symbolic content that has been designed into them. The value of design, the value of good design, has rapidly increased in this market. So you have what is sometimes called symbolic capital, a form of capital, a form of economic resource that is based in symbolism. The example I often use is shoes. When you buy a pair of sports shoes, the vast bulk of what you pay for is the brand name. The actual making of the shoe is a much smaller portion of the economic value of the product. And all of this comes together under the label that I put at the bottom here, which is neoliberalism, which is a new multinational global regime of capitalism, under which we find a kind of global deregulation of markets. The idea that capital can flow easily from one market to another, this transforms cities. This is, I can see some eyes glazing over around the room. This is the world, though, into which you're entering. These are the conditions under which urban design is practiced and will be practiced when you're out there as professionals. Neoliberalism changes everything for urban design, and I want to sketch a few of those issues as well. The first thing it does is it introduces intercity competition. This is why we have iconic architectural projects. This is why cities will hire a global starchitect, a star architect, to come in and build an iconic building that will capture the attention of the global stage and say, Bilbao or Bangkok are now trendy cities for people to come and invest in, to live in, to whatever. So there's the importance of symbolic capital, the importance of attracting investors and attracting tourists. We get what's often called place branding. We brand the city. Instead of managing the city, instead of planning the city, instead of designing the city, we brand the city. Just as the running shoes were branded with a Nike slash, and that becomes a key part of where the investment goes, cities become branded in the same way, often with iconic urban design projects, a new waterfront project, often an alliance between private and public interests, often coupled to an erosion of democratic planning, depending on how democratic the planning was in the first place. The erosion comes about because there is a new alliance with public-private partnerships, so-called PPPs, where the project is private as far as the public are concerned, but public as far as many of the private partners are concerned. It's a complex new set of arrangements between the state and private interests. We see the state beginning to set up special development zones, often zones of low taxation, where new kinds of urban design product can take off. The kind of practices that we see in Dubai are often of this kind, the kind that you see in the Pudong area of Shanghai, if you know anything about that. And this often produces polarized landscapes where investment flows in to produce some parts of cities that are highly valued, often utopian, where large amounts of investment are possible to produce very high quality urban design in a particular part of the city, which is then isolated off as a site of privilege within a larger sea of dereliction. And we often see also the privatisation of public space. That's often what goes on with this. So we see the city beginning to polarise into some zones where only the wealthy get access, where urban design is high value and high quality, and other parts of the city where urban design is poor, where the investment doesn't happen, and so you get a kind of a double class of city. And you often get the kind of focus on parts of the city which are not particularly urban, if you like. So urban design becomes less urban, it becomes less public, it becomes less open to everyone in the city. This is one way of looking at this take on what's happening here. If you imagine public space being divided into two ways of thinking about this, this one is about who gets access. Everyone gets access, access restricted to some people, and only private. So this is your house and mine, and that's the street. This is loosely various kinds of control or restricted access. And the other one is about who gets control. If it's publicly controlled, it's over there, private control here. So this creates a field where the truly public space, the space of the street or the park, the beach, the public transport, is truly public, and then a truly private space here. But we see the emergence of both social enclaves here, of restricted public spaces over there, and of quasi-public spaces in here. This has been the big area of extension under neoliberal urban design. That's where, I'm afraid to say, a large piece of the market is. That's where a lot of the money is made. That is where the temptations will be for you. And that's a part of the dilemma. Because those projects, and I'm just going to very briefly describe three of them, are, when they get large enough, they become seriously anti-urban. This is the way in which cities are being killed. Gated communities, of course, are a retreat. Largely, not all gated communities. There are gated communities for the poor. But by and large, the ones that we're talking about here are retreats, whether they are in, that is the extractor, Bangkok advertisement, I think, and this one is in Western Australia, in my hometown. Not vastly different. These are global projects, by the way. They are relatively formularised. You will often find that they incorporate their own architects. They may fly in their own architects to do them in Bangkok, who knows. Very much a retreat from the city. The idea of a sense of place, a community, a kind of instant place identity that's created where we can retreat from the city, usually in our car, behind gates and guards, to a realm where the so-called public realm, which is the streets and the parks, are actually a private realm. They usually emerge under conditions where security and fear of crime and danger and sometimes a fear of difference, sometimes a fear of racial difference are exacerbated. They tend to flourish. There are very few in Europe. There are a lot in North America, and there's quite a lot in different parts of Southeast Asia. They tend to be based on a desire, or sort of a double desire really. One is to get away from a city that is seen as a public city that is seen as harsh and perhaps dangerous, but also to get to the positive benefits of being in a sequestered realm where your sense of identity, often social class identity, is reinforced, often sold as themed environments. This one here is modelled after an Italian hill town. It's actually in California. This one modelled after a Mexican theme. The idea of a retreat to often an idealised past with a certain authenticity of village life, a simpler, safer and friendlier realm. away, it's an anti-urban turn, away from the idea of the city as this place of engagement, of traffic and of productivity. Not all enclaves, housing enclaves, have gates and guards. There are quite a lot that are, in a sense, simply utilise the shapes and forms of urban design to create a space which is sequestered from the intrusions of difference in the larger city. This is one in Melbourne. Gated communities, in my view, when they get to be more than about a hectare, tend to reduce the public permeability of the city. They restrict the ways in which we get around, not only the people inside the gated enclave, but they restrict the way in which all citizens can get across the city, whether on bikes or cars or walking. They represent a kind of an abandonment of public space, a kind of what some people call the secession of the successful. The more privileged people in a city retreat to their gated enclaves and then cease to care or be willing to pay for the investment in truly public space. And ultimately, gating accentuates social divisions in the city. It cuts across the great project of urban design to contribute to social justice. That was the first of the three projects that I'm saying are problematic. The second one is private shopping malls. Now, I have to admit before I give this little argument that most of my work on shopping malls has not been based in Asian cities like Bangkok, but in Western car-dominated cities and the kind of shopping malls that you see on the right rather than the paragon that you see on the left here. But there are some commonalities between shopping malls globally, and I wanted to focus on those. And the first is that they set up, just as the gated communities did, an opposition between the public city and the private city. The shopping mall is safe when the city is seen as dangerous. It's clean when the public city is seen as dirty, as derelict, as disordered. It's a centre of order within a disordered city. It's dry when the weather is wet. It's cool when the weather is hot. It's warm when the weather is cold. It's often a place of theme-based fantasy where you can live in the past or live in a kind of an illusionary world. This is a sort of a world where dreams come alive in the shopping mall, as opposed to the rather mundane reality of ordinary, everyday urban life. This is at least the story of the shopping mall. Just a few. It's a place bereft of politics and bereft of much of the grit of urban life that, in my view, makes it urban. And again, like the gated enclaves, is often a themed environment. That one was themed, I think, as a Roman forum. And it has produced, at least in the West, what is sometimes called mall sickness. The sense that shopping malls that turn their back on the city, that create a world in opposition to the city, create forms of disorientation. And a lot of the shopping malls, and I'm just going to show you a few slides about what's happening with shopping malls, are actually trying to re-import some of the more real aspects of the city, more authentic aspects of the city, to authenticate the experience of the shopping mall. This is not a good example, but it's a church service that's happening in the shopping mall in Manila, in the Philippines. But some of the others are interesting too. This is a shopping mall, or it was a shopping mall in Los Angeles, originally designed by the famous architect Frank Gehry, but then demolished because it was so enclosed. It was an old-fashioned kind of shopping mall, and here it was redesigned. The roof was taken off, and it was turned as much as they could back into real streets. Still private, but you take the roof off, and part of that street, the top part, is public street in Los Angeles, in Santa Monica, it's on front of the beach suburbs, and this part is part of what used to be the shopping mall. So there's this turnaround of the shopping mall, an attempt to turn itself inside out, and to regain, if you like, some real urban life and some authenticity. You can't do this everywhere because Los Angeles has a wonderful climate, and so taking the roof off is just a thorough and sensible thing to do. I'm not sure it'll work quite so well in somewhere like Bangkok or even in Melbourne. This is one in Bristol. So before shot and an after shot. This is a new shopping mall. Let's go back and forwards again. There it was. That was the old town. And there's the new. So the shopping mall, in this case, instead of taking the shopping mall as a standalone project and putting it out in the suburbs surrounded by car parking, here you've got the shopping mall being grafted onto the traditional city, even almost made to look like it's an extension of the old traditional city of Bristol, which is in the west of the UK. And back in Melbourne, this is the largest shopping mall in the southern hemisphere. There might be larger ones in Bangkok. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if there are, but nonetheless. In Australia, we pride ourselves on having the biggest or the whatever in the southern hemisphere, knowing that there aren't that many large cities like Melbourne in the southern hemisphere. It's called Chadstone. The thing I would point out here is this is right out in the suburbs. It's one of the most unsustainable forms of urban design that we have inherited, and one of the biggest challenges, because you have this entirely inwardly focused shopping mall, and all of this, all of this is car parking. Many, many hectares of car park. So you've effectively got an inward-facing shopping mall, many hectares of car park, and then suburbs. And around them is a wall, like the Berlin Wall, that separates it off with the surrounding residents who can't walk to the shopping mall, and they hate the shopping mall. They don't want it there, because everyone drives to it, it just generates traffic. The real task here, though, is to turn around what is, and all of these, the three that I've mentioned, the gated communities, we'll get on to another one in a minute, the shopping malls, are in a sense anti-urban projects. And one of the challenges is to try and reconfigure them and rethink them. How could this be part of a low-carbon city? If you were to put a new high-volume public transport connections through the shopping mall, and if you could then talk the owners of the shopping mall into redeveloping all of that car park land as a real city, that's one of the challenges, one of the biggest challenges of urban design. And this is not the only project type where you find that happening. We're faced with the task of trying to convert, at least in North America and Australasia, our cities are fundamentally car dependent. I'm finding it a little bit alarming to see the degree to which cities like Bangkok are migrating towards car dependency from relatively low car dependency. When you look at the global league tables as to how many CO2 emissions per capita, meaning per person, we generate, I'm ashamed to say that Australia and USA head the global league table. And a lot of that has to do with our cities. A lot of it has to do with the fact that we have inherited cities where we need cars. We need more than one car per family just to get around. So it's that question. If you're able to reconfigure the city according to that DMA and organise how we get around with walkability and public transport as primary and car as secondary, then you can have a low carbon city. When everyone needs to have a car, when the densities are so low that public transport cannot be made to work economically, meaning you cannot get a frequent public transport service that is at a low cost, then you've got a car-dependent city. And that's what we've inherited. That's one of our biggest challenges. And the third of these, if I've got time, I think maybe we should slow down and have some questions. I was going to talk about some of the problems of very large towers, and I'll do this very, very quickly, and then we'll stop and have some questions. I'm not opposed to tall buildings. I think that there really is a case for tall buildings, and I think it was, I put it before when I said that, that density is one of the great questions of urban design. How close can we get? The taller the building, in many cases, the denser that you get. When you build tall buildings, you increase the density by and large. This is not always true. If you surround those buildings with lots and lots of open space, then you're not actually getting density at all. You're just getting towers that are spaced out. But beyond a certain scale, large, tall buildings also are anti-urban buildings. And I'm going to try to explain to you why. In the early 20th century, when the first skyscrapers emerged in New York and Chicago, the ones that we hear about in architectural and urban history, the Chrysler Building, the Woolworths Building and others like it, these were buildings that were inspiring. And if you look hard at the base of the buildings, you'll find that they sit very comfortably in the city, that they add density to the street, that they add street life. They were not sitting on very large parking garages. They were not drive-in, drive-out facilities. They were buildings that added density to the city and added density to the street life of the city. When it gets beyond a certain scale, they start, as New Yorkers were the first, as Manhattan, people in Manhattan were the first to point out and the first to get organised to fight against, tall buildings can start to darken the street at ground level, can start to kill off the street at ground level, and detract from the very urban life that they initially contribute to. This is one of the reasons. If you imagine a 40-metre building, let's say about 10 stories, and you look at the section looking a little bit like that, and as it doubles, you find that the amount of elevator space that you have to use to get in and out more than doubles. It goes up exponentially. Until you've got to the point where the vast bulk of the volume is required to get the people, the goods, the electricity, the water, the sewage, in and out of the building. A tall building is a cul-de-sac. Everything comes in and out one end. It's not a network. And beyond a certain scale, it starts to become anti-urban. Not only do you lose all of the space with the elevators, you also start to build very large parking garages at the base. And so what you find with most of the skyscrapers of the 21st century is that they need a very large base at ground level upon which to work. And when they do that, they space further and further out. And when they do that, they become less and less dense. Melbourne, in the 1990s, made a claim to have the world's tallest building. This was a very stupid idea, and I, along with a lot of others, tried to fight it. In the end, the building didn't stack up economically. Partly it doesn't stack up economically, by the way, because this is not very economic. It costs a lot in energy to build taller and taller. Tall buildings become uneconomic after a certain height because it's no longer possible to simply stack extra floors without putting extra elevators and so on in. They then often turn to the state and say, why don't you subsidise it? It will be the tallest building in the world. The rest of the world will look at us and salute us for having the tallest building in the world. A lot of us think that's actually not true, that what happens is that the tallest building in the world moves around from one city to another every few years, and until someone else comes along and builds a taller one. Nonetheless, my argument here is that as buildings get taller, they give less and less back to the city. That most of the urban benefits of density come in about the first 10 stories. Now, I'm not saying there shouldn't be buildings over 10 stories. I'm saying the returns start to diminish above about 10 stories. There are some very good urbanists. Jan Jacobs was sort of among them. She didn't put a height limit on it. She was a great proponent of density, but she believed in low-rise, high density. Christopher Alexander was opposed to buildings above about 4 or 5 floors. I think he was wrong. I think it was too low. And ultimately, this all comes back to questions of density, mix, access, text, and action. These, what I'm calling these anti-urban types. I simply want you to have a critique, because these are the ones that I believe that you will be asked to deal with, whether as planners or as urban designers, perhaps as architects. I'm asking you to engage with what are their impacts on the ways in which the city works in terms of density, how close can we get, in terms of mix, the way in which different attractions are juxtaposed in the city so that we can walk from one to the other, the ways in which we get around the access networks, the public transport networks and the pedestrian networks, the ways in which the text or the meanings of the city are layered on this, and in terms of action, what happens in public space. I'll leave it there. I'm happy to take some questions. We'll have discussion if we have time. Thanks for me.
If anyone have a question, can start the session now. Questions?
Maybe I start the first question. Okay. When you talk about mix, you think that it's going to be naturally mixed, or it needs to be planned mix that going to benefit the newly urban design development or even the old town redevelopment?
Traditional cities, there is what you might call a natural mix involved. And that has to do with the fact that shopping, retail, the visiting function, tends to migrate towards the main streets. And so you automatically get that kind of mix happening. You also get a vertical mix happening. You get a shop, so-called shop houses, with a shop on the ground floor and residential or offices above. Offices above is a mix between visiting and working. A shop house is a mix between living and visiting. And so those mixes do happen, if you like, naturally. Although natural is not a word that I much like to use about cities, because cities are not like forests. There is an urban ecology, but it is not. It is a human process. Cities are indeed designed, but cities emerge more than anything else. So, your question is whether the mix should be designed. I think to some degree it can be designed, but I think that there's also a case for not controlling the zoning in a way that enables an economic mix to emerge of its own accord. So the question becomes, from a planning perspective, what's the role of the state? Is it the role of the state to decide what shall happen in every building? Or is it the role of the state to prevent what happens in one building from destroying the amenity of the one next door or upstairs? And I think it's the latter. There is a role of the state to stop dysfunctions occurring. You do not want a car panel beating workshop being installed underneath a housing project where it keeps everyone up or whatever. So I think it's a complex answer to that. But mixed is a very, very complex question, actually. And it's a mix, again, a mix of it's a social mix of different kinds of people, it's a mix of different kinds of buildings, and it's a mix of different kinds of functions. Any attempt to control it completely from the top down is likely to fail for the same reason that most modernist cities failed when they tried to control all of the functions in the city. In the capital city of Australia, Canberra, it's a model, a global model of a planned city. And when you drive through Canberra, and you will drive because the density is too low for public transport, you can't find any shops. And the reason you can't find any shops is that the shops were not allowed to be on the main road. So if you want to shop in Canterbury, you look for a sign that says shops. it's totally against the way in which cities naturally emerge, if you like.
Yes. I have one question, and another one is not a question. The first one is that everyone knows about urbanization and how crucial it is in terms of what we are being now. But anyway, why urban design as a discipline? How come it is so slow to be emerged? It takes more than 50 years to become a discipline. And even by now, few people knows about it. I think I am very surprised about that. The second one is that since you mentioned about blending the city, I have an idea that you may make some comments or giving me some blending of Bangkok. Since our previous plan, I think already gone. For example, Venice of the East, and what else? City of Angels. We don't see that anymore in Bangkok. So I would like to have your ideas about how to plan Bangkok for the moment.
I'm not sure about the second question, but I'll try the first one. Why has urban design taken so long to emerge as a discipline? I think part of the answer to that might be that I don't think it's quite the same kind of discipline as architecture and, say, landscape, or in particular architecture. Because architecture is focused on a particular task of the designing of buildings, and the profession is based in a received body of knowledge about that. And I'm not sure that urban design is quite so easy to codify, not quite so easy to agree on what the core knowledge base is as a discipline. But I think that there's another dimension there as well. You say you're surprised that it's taken so long to emerge. That there is a long history of urban thinking that, in my mind, and I'm thinking of the people that I happen to value, goes back to people like Patrick Geddes in the 19th century, and then there's a series of Ildefons Serda, who designed large pieces of Barcelona. These were urbanists of the highest order, people who thought hard about city form, who were not urban planners in that traditional sense, because they really were about shaping of public space. And then that comes through to Jane Jacobs, Kevin Lynch, Cullen, Christopher Alexander. These are people from the 1960s. And then there's another, almost a boom of urban design thinking, and a lot of consensus across the kind of things that they were thinking. And I don't think it's been a lack of understanding the ways in which urban design thinking should go since then, so much as the increasing complexity of how cities have changed, and an incapacity to really come to grips with the complexities of it. And I think there's another dimension there which I've passed on here as well. Since the 1970s, the global economy has been in the grip of neoliberal thinking, which suggests that cities, along with all other systems, should be deregulated, that markets are the best way to service the public interest, that let the free market rip and the benefits will trickle down to the less advantaged. This is simply not true. There's a lot of evidence. This does not happen. And that neoliberalism, that neoliberal consensus about deregulation has been extraordinarily damaging and has widened income gaps and social and economic inequalities right across the globe. But that has been the framework within which urban design thinking has been taking place. And so that has been the framework within which what I'm calling anti-urban ideals, the shopping malls, the gated communities, the hyper-tall towers, the large mega projects that consume very large tracts of public land, the polarisation of the urban landscape, those rather anti-urban ideas have taken root within a context of neoliberal political economic thinking. And I think that might be a reason why, if you like, urban design as a discipline is not seen to have somehow matured. I think there is a lot of good urban design thinking around. I think that we've hardly started. We've got a long way to go. But I find it interesting that the work of people like Jacobs and so on is now getting increased attention after 50 years. There is something about the productivity of cities that she tapped, and the creativity of cities. One of my research, I didn't come here to talk about research projects, but one of my research projects is on creative clusters. Now, creative clusters, by which I do not mean creative cities. I mean the question of why is it in every city that creative industries, young, small, upstart firms of designers, of artists, of all kinds of computer game inventors, scientists and so on, tend to gravitate towards certain parts of cities and not others. And where do they go and why? And are there some urban design characteristics about those places? And I suggest that there are. I suggest that you can put into Google a bunch of keywords on almost any city and you will find that there's a clustering of creative industries in certain kinds of neighbourhoods. And they have characteristics in common. They are relatively high density, low rise. They are not in shopping malls. They are not in gated enclaves. They are not in tall towers. They are in highly diverse, mixed, dense and walkable neighbourhoods, usually within, well integrated with the larger access networks across the city as well. I won't say any more about that, but I think that Jacobs was tapping something about the ways in which cities generate productivity and creativity, and that has relevance for the larger economy in ways that we haven't really understood yet enough, and that urban design can add something to that. But they're very good questions. Your second question was, what have I got to say about the urban planning in Bangkok? And I don't know how to answer that. I don't know enough about Bangkok to pass any judgment. I mean, I could give you my impressions if you like, but I'm not sure what they're worth is the problem, you see.
For me, actually, Bangkok is a natural city. It's without any planning. It keeps going on, growing, and for the moment they have more than 10 million people in the city. And finally, I think we cannot going on like this anymore. Something has to be done. At present, probably you know well that there are huge projects, which I can say that this is real urban design project going on around the river, some of them, but along the rail also. All that, I think, we don't have any theory control of it from the point of view of urban design.
Well, all I can say is that it's not news to me. I think the planning system in Australia has largely fallen apart too. And I see it as part of the broader notion that we have looked collectively to markets. I think you used the word natural too. I would say that this is a kind of market-led cities. I don't believe that the best cities have ever come together through a kind of purely deregulated market. I think we know what really deregulated cities look like. They look a bit like Houston or some of the North American, some of the more radically market-driven cities of North America. But they will have different views, of course. I'm not sure how you stop when you say that Bangkok is over 10 million. People come to the city because the cities produce jobs, because cities aren't productive. They're productive of jobs, and it's hard to tell people that somehow you're irrational. You should go back to rural poverty when the jobs are actually being produced in the cities. I think we need to return a little bit to urban planning thinking, but I think it will be a different kind of urban planning thinking than we used to have. I think we used to, as urban planners, I'm not an urban planner by the way, so I'm an interloper completely here, but I often get mistaken for a planner. I think planning used to be under a model that was loosely called the rational comprehensive model of urban planning, meaning that the state is in charge and the planners as professionals will analyse the city, and they will rationally and comprehensively analyse where the problems are, and that if you've decided that a new public transit line is necessary or a new road is necessary, that somehow it will get planned. That's not the way cities actually work. My own view is that there's far too much money flows in urban development processes for politicians to stay out of it. They won't stay out of it. They don't stay out of it. There was a time when we had planning agencies that were at arm's length from government. Therefore, when the decisions were made, they were made with a long time span of maybe 50 years. And it's not as if democracy is an answer to this. Democracy is a piece of the problem. In the context where I come from, there is a 4-year cycle. And politicians, by and large, are not interested in the 50-year cycle, which is the one that you need in order to plan a city effectively. They're interested in 4 years. Therefore, they want to know, can we have this project, this new iconic project, by an international star architect? Will it be finished before the next election so that I can benefit? So it is about flows of capital, symbolic capital that turns into political capital that turns into votes, and in some cases turns into the economic capital that the developers will pay to my political party if I approve their project. So there's a lot of corruption in urban development that is very, very difficult to stop in Australia or here, I suspect.
Any more questions? Oh, maybe I try to begin with the last question. We were discussing about the role of place in our globalizing world. Like we have the problem of global warming, the rise of aging population, traffic congestion. I think it's important for the student to think about, the role of place, or the important, do we need to think about this right now? Among other problems that we have in the city.
I haven't talked a lot about place here today, and partly because I think it's easily misunderstood. This is what I mean by place. So if urban design is a form of placemaking, then for me, these are the questions, and this is the means of thinking about place. Place is what emerges from this. Place is what emerges, the experience. Place is experiential. Place is the way in which a city delivers at the larger scale. When people say Bangkok is is a chaotic place. That is an emergent effect. When people say, oh, I love Bangkok, they're talking about Bangkok as a place, or if they're talking about a particular part of it. But these are effects. When people sit down and say, urban design is a place-making activity, therefore I will design a place, I often feel that the first mistake has already been made, and that what ends up is a rather particularised, slightly utopian, or an attempt to insert a little piece of utopia into the chaos. And that's what I see happening a lot in global cities generally, not just Bangkok. So I'm a bit wary about placemaking as a top-down activity. I think authentic places emerge from a multiplicity of bottom-up processes.
For Chris.
So I'm not sure if it's a question or more a comment on your lecture. It was very interesting, first of all. I don't know how long have you been in Bangkok, or how much you know about Bangkok.
I've been here about 6 times. This time only a few days, well, 4 or 5 days.
Okay.
I've spent weeks at a time here before, but that's I wrote a chapter of the book, Framing Places, is about Ratchadan Avenue as a political space. So I published a little bit on that, and one of my PhD students was studying different parts of Bangkok, and I published some stuff with her. One of those papers was on Ban Pantong, which is a neighbourhood just north of Khao San Road. So there's a few bits that I know reasonably well, and other than that, no. I enjoy Bangkok, actually, is what I do. I consume Bangkok.
Because I have some actually sad news for you. Because if you would be longer in Bangkok, all what you talk about today, you know, the 3 main problems, I'm quite surprised that everybody is so calm and don't say anything about it, because actually what you show us is actually what's going on in Bangkok, and there's a demand for it, you know. Everybody wants to live in this gated community. We have tons of them around in Bangkok. If they cannot live outside, they want to have this gated community in form of a tower. Shopping malls, I don't know how much you know about it, but in other cities we try to connect the parks with green corridors. In Thailand they connect the shopping mall with skywalks. And now we have already like a 6-kilometer one, you know, starting in MBK, Siam Discovery, Siam Paragon. Then you go to Central World, and now the next one is, what is the new one? Central Embassy, right? And if it's going on, you end up at Terminal 21, and then you go to, you know, and so on and so on. But the people love it. And when you see the advertising, and the advertising tells actually the ideals of a country. You know, it's all about, you know, like the brand you look up to for BMW, else things like the river, you know, all these names for these new condos, the address, who tells who you are and all the things. And especially the thing you mentioned with all these names of branding, like Colosseum things. We have tons of this, yeah? People go to Khao Yai to see the Toscana Valley, or in Pattaya we have now the Colosseum, or in Hue Hin we have the Venice, you know? And people love it. So I think like...
Okay. It's not news to me. There's a reason why I focused on those 3 things today. Okay, there's other things I could have talked about. I know that's what's popular here. That's the way it's going. I see it as a threat. I see it as anti-urban. I understand a lot of people in this room would probably see, in a sense, the proliferation of those 3 types as being forms of success. I'm putting an alternate view. I'm also surprised that I'm not having anyone wanting to argue with me. I think you're probably being very polite. I'm simply saying that this is my view of what a city is that it is a production of public space. The space high up in a tower is not public space. The space in the shopping mall is not truly public space. The gated community is not truly public space. So what we have is a city where quasi-public spaces and private spaces are being interconnected and in a sense masquerading as a city. But probably the one part of your comment, which there's a question too, that I would want to think about is when you say people like it. Some people like it, but a lot of people don't actually have any access to it. So there's a social division that this is reinforcing in Thailand. I will make a comment on the SkyTrain. The SkyTrain appears to me to be operating at about somewhere below half of its capacity, meaning that the trains are nowhere near as long as the platforms. It has been designed for a much greater volume than it's currently used for, even though the trains are relatively full. So I'm not saying it's not efficient. It's very efficient. So for someone like me who can afford to ride the SkyTrain, I think that's fine. There's a lot of people, the trainers on the street beneath Sukhumvit, who are not on the SkyTrain. And I believe, or my guess is, I could have this wrong coming in as an outsider, my guess is they cannot afford it. That the SkyTrain is in a sense a middle class train. It's a middle class public transport system and it works really well. I was here before the SkyTrain was operating and I can remember. And I think it is a wonderful piece of planning. So there is some planning going on in Bangkok and I think I wish Melbourne would do something like the SkyTrain. We need public transport very badly. But I've got to say that the experience of public transport in Melbourne is different in another way. It is crowded, it is packed, and it includes all kinds of people, not just those who can afford it. So it's, I worry that not everyone is actually enjoying the shopping mall gated community experience in Bangkok.
Can I add something to the BTS? It's absolutely right. It's for a specific society. I think you don't see workers, construction site workers on the BTS or maids, right? But I think the BTS collapsed already the system. You know, when you see along the BTS line, there's all these new condos and high-rise building where the middle class or upper class are living. And when you go there at 7 and 8 o'clock in the morning, you cannot enter the train anymore, and they cannot put even more trains on the track. So what people are doing already, they take the train outside the city, change the station, and going backside in the other direction. So, and they're still advertising it. If you move in a new condo, you have the BTS in front of you, but it's not working anymore. So that's my experience, especially around 7, 8 o'clock in the morning. I don't know if your experience, but it's my one from the BTS. But actually, I wanted to finish with the real last question. When I see the development, or in many development countries, the people do exactly the same stupid mistakes what the industry countries did like 40, 50, 60 years ago. Like, you know, in the 50s and 60s, we built everything for the cars, and the status symbol was a car, and we did a lot of these concrete bridges. And I see this happen all around in Bangkok to solve the problem. Or 30 years ago, it was popular to be green and don't use plastic bag. Now it comes to Bangkok again 30 years later. And the people doing again, all these mistakes you show us from other countries, actually Thailand could learn from it and do it in a better way, but they don't. And this is a question you can see in many developing countries and cities, and I don't get the point why the people doing the same mistakes again and again and again.
That's not a question I can answer, I don't think.
Okay.
I'll take the comment.
So that's a good point to end this question for us all. Thank you very much, Professor Dowie. Thank you very much.
Okay, so yeah, don't forget to hand in your note lecture today, okay?
Well done.